All right. Welcome to Duke University Chapel. I'm Luke Powery, the Dean of the Chapel, and on behalf of the entire staff, welcome to what James B. Duke called the Great Towering Church. This conversation this afternoon is titled Facing the Flood, Faith and Action for the Rising Generation. It's part of our Bridge Panel series, these conversations in which we attempt to connect people from disparate walks of life in order to discover shared pathways toward the beloved community of God around various topics. And this particular Bridge Panel is as part of our inaugural Green and Fair Chapel Day. And so, as you can see, we believe in swag, so you're welcome to take these gifts home with you as part of this special inaugural day here at the chapel. So the title of today's conversation comes from a recent documentary featuring Leonardo DiCaprio called Before the Flood. And many people were here last night, about 50 to 60 folks, who screened the film here in the chapel. And I hope some of you were able to be present for that conversation. If not, that's okay. Watching that film is not a prerequisite for attending this conversation. We understand that many are dealing with final exams and grading at this time of the semester. So I say the film was not required because it makes points about climate change and humanity's relationship to creation. In many ways those points have been made in other places and times. In fact, one of the central allusions in the documentary is to a Renaissance era triptych painting called The Garden of Earthly Delights. And in that painting, the artist, Hieronymus Bosch, depicts the fall from grace of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, which then leads into other panels which depict a creation progressively destroyed by human greed and gluttony. So that raises the question, how will we respond to calls to care for creation from Bosch, DiCaprio, even Pope Francis, and many others? That's the focus of our conversation today. And being here in the chapel, a chapel that is now beginning to strive to be green and fair, we explore today, among other things, what role faith has in shaping our understanding of and response to environmental challenges of our day. So today I have 4 guests, colleagues here from Duke University who are working at the heart of this conversation. First to my left is Dr. Saskia Cornez, who is the Farm and Program Manager at Duke Farm. Next to her is Dr. Brian Murray, who has many titles, but he is the Director of the Environmental Economics Program at Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, and also Director of the Duke University Energy Initiative. Next to him, we have Ms. Lena Connor, who's a senior MDiv student at Duke Divinity School. She also is the chair of the student group Creation Matters. Next to her, we have Dr. Norman Wiersba, who is a professor of theology, ecology, and agrarian studies at Duke Divinity School. He's also a senior fellow at the Kenan Institute of Ethics and also a very close colleague who is connected deeply to the chapel community. So let's welcome all of our guests. I will say, before I pose the first question to them, that there are cards that maybe you received as you came in, or Andy Ray, my colleague, will hand those to you, on which at any point during the conversation you can write down a question. So there will be a time for Q&A at the end where you will turn in the cards and then we will pose those questions to our panelists. So, to get this started, and I'd like to pose a first question, and then we'll see where this goes. The first question is, coming from your particular perspectives and backgrounds and disciplines and fields of study, what, from your perspective, what are some of the environmental challenges that you see in your discipline or field of work? And to play off of the documentary, are we really facing the flood? Who wants to jump in first?
You go, Brian.
Well, first of all, I've been elected to go first. People start running for the aisles, I'll know why. So I do want to thank you so much for inviting me here. I've been in this chapel many times. I went to graduate school here. I've been a faculty member here for a while. I have actually never looked in this direction. I've only looked that direction coming in. So it's really wonderful and in a way almost intimidating to be back here. Well, I'm not going to focus so much on the environmental calamities that were featured in the movie. I think it's fairly not straightforward, but it's fairly apparent what types of risks we are putting society in. Obviously, whether you look at this from a moral perspective, a social perspective, or an economic perspective, this is a problem that we need to fix. We need to figure out how to work on how to fix it. And fixing it can mean a lot of different things. It should start with the notion that it's largely a result of the emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are largely the result of activities that we take as a human society to try to advance in many ways as a human society, but that has produced these consequences, I'm an economist by training, what economists would call an externality, and what anybody who thinks about society would say there is no such thing as an externality. Nothing is outside, and that's actually the point. When people make decisions to advance their own livelihoods, they do so thinking not necessarily about all of the consequences of that decision that they're making. So we could view the problem, so I look at it through a solutions lens. So how do we reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases and still achieve a standard of living that is one that we would want to aspire to? And then how do we adapt to the changes that are going to happen kind of regardless of the actions that we take? To me, the challenges really come in how do you achieve those solutions, recognizing that there are really no silver bullets. There are no sort of just pathways that you can take that don't have any pushback, any trade-offs, any sort of repercussions for other socially desirable goals. So for instance, so the energy initiative that I direct, our mission is to help, we are an integrative hub for research, education, and engagement on Duke's campus, but the mission is to advance an affordable, reliable, safe, clean energy system for all. And so clearly, for those of you who don't know anyway, 3/4 of the global greenhouse gas emissions really come from the production and use of energy. Most of the rest come from the production the production of food. And so when we think about safe and clean, of course, climate change is at the front of the list of things that are unsafe and unclean about how we're producing our energy system. But those aren't the only things. So for instance, the most significant form of carbon-free power that we can produce at scale right now is nuclear energy. Is that clean? It certainly it's clean in some senses, and it doesn't emit carbon dioxide when electricity is produced, but it produces many other environmental risks that we have to face. So we could go into, there's many things that reducing the greenhouse gases also helps clean up a lot of other things. If you reduce the use of coal, you reduce the emissions of particulate matter, you reduce the emissions of mercury. All of these are all pointing in the same direction. But sometimes when you choose a cleaner energy source, it turns out to be a more expensive energy source. And we have members of our society who face energy poverty. More than 10% of their household income is devoted to paying their energy bill. And then in other parts of the world, we have people who are trying to advance to the type of, they aspire to social and economic advancement in ways that we're familiar with, but they don't have. There's 1.2 billion people on the earth who don't have any access to electricity, and two times that many don't have access to clean and modern cooking systems, and therefore they have indoor air pollution problems. So how do we help advance? So when I look at this as a sort of a moral issue, I think, how do we help those people advance and live what they would regard as purposeful lives, and do so in a way that doesn't follow the same pathway that has created the problem that we've got? It's often easy for us, and this will be my concluding comment, it's often easy for us to think that these are choices between luxuries and the environment. That if we just don't have that vacation home, or we don't take too many trips to the movies or too many vacations, whatever it is, we can help improve the environment. But over the 300 years in human civilization that we've accumulated these greenhouse gases, we've also increased life expectancies almost by a factor of 3. It has allowed people to, the abundant harnessing of abundant fossil fuel energy has allowed many people on this earth to achieve a much higher standard of living, moving beyond the most basic life of a life expectancy of 30 to be able to, for instance, dedicate time towards education in the pursuit of other aspirations. And so I guess I would conclude by saying, to me, the challenges are in how do we advance everything that we want to advance. As members of the faith, we want people to thrive. And you need a clean environment to thrive, but you need other things to thrive. And how do we sort of balance those things out?
Thank you. Someone else.
And I have a lady speaking.
So I think it helps for me to tell through story. So I came to to the intersection of theology and ecology through living with communities elsewhere in the world that were thinking about these things a lot harder than we are. And I lived for a summer in the Atlantic rainforest in Brazil. And there, it's adjacent to the Amazon and is incredibly biodiverse. And I lived amongst a very low-income farming community. They don't have cars. They get around on scooters or donkeys, and they're part of this initiative to do sustainable farming in Brazil. But maybe 5 years ago, the Brazilian government gave a title for an aluminum company, a multinational conglomerate, to come and strip mine the whole area. And so I was doing research on this mining and how it was going to affect the local farmers, and encountered this group of Franciscan monks who were living amongst this community, trying to advocate for the illiterate farmers and make sure their land wasn't being taken from them, and also educate the farmers on why conserving rainforest was essential. And so one day I was walking, doing interviews, and this little man came up to me, a farmer, and he grabbed my earlobe, and I had a gold earring, and he said, "Americans, you don't understand because you think this is precious," pointing to my ear, "but we understand that water is precious, and we understand that climate change is real, and you're living in blindness." He just kept on saying over that and over again. And I was kind of taken aback because he had my earlobe, and he wouldn't let it go. But it struck me to the core of my being, because I realized that there's this great, I'm going to kind of skip to the next question in some ways, but there's this great passage in Luke 22 when Jesus is telling his disciples that there will be times when the whole world is scared because of what the signs in the heavens and what's happening to the world and the roaring sea. And he says, don't be in a drunken stupor, essentially. And I feel like in America, we're kind of in a drunken stupor about the reality of climate change. And here was this illiterate farmer, and I was supposed to be the researcher, and he was speaking more truth to me about climate change and the fate of the whole world. And I think we just have to be alert, awake, and alive in this time.
Saskia or Norman?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about my position as a theologian, scholar of religion, and then there'd be another kind of answer that I would give just as a citizen. But I think the first thing that I would say is that the history of Christianity, and not just Christianity, other faith traditions too, is one that has worked actively against this kind of work. And we have to be very upfront about this. I still encounter all sorts of Christian folks, or at least self-professing Christians, who will say that the concerns of this panel are not at all concerns of faith. And, we see this in the political discourses of some who use Christianity as a way to say, look, God would never let this happen, or more basically, that Christian faith is not about the earth. It's about your soul and getting your soul to heaven. And so we've got within Christianity itself and its history, I think, a terribly misguided understanding of what the faith is about, so that even when they come to our divinity school here, this kind of conversation is viewed with great suspicion, that it's just some sort of agenda. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done within faith communities to see how within their own traditions there are ways to speak about this world and our place in it, about the economies by which we live, the political structures by which we organize things, so that we no longer see these concerns about environmental health and well-being as something that we shouldn't care about, but in fact see them as really central. And so there's a lot of work to do. I mean, gradually we're seeing Christians see how important this is. Pope Francis's encyclical was really an important moment. But when you look at the reception of that encyclical by all sorts of Christians, it was viewed with serious suspicion or even hatred and loathing by some. So that's an indication of there's a lot of work to be done.
Saskia, what?
I can speak to a different part of that question. So I was raised in a Buddhist household, which has a different set of outlooks, and perhaps from the ones that you're describing, Norman. And they're basically they're called the divine abodes, for positive qualities that one's meant to cultivate in oneself. And two of my favorites are the ideas of metta and the ideas of karuna. So metta really means to have a feeling of friendliness, feeling of goodwill and compassion towards all beings. And this idea of karuna means to see a kind of, it's sometimes described as being related to the non-self, but really that it means that there's no distinction between my experience and the experience of another being. And I think maybe the idea of reincarnation also kind of ups this ante, because the idea is that it's a great blessing to come into this life as a human, because to be a human means to have discernment, to be able to create change. But the idea of reincarnation also means that one could come back as any being at all, as an animal, as a plant, and these beings, at least in the tradition that I was raised, are considered part of this circle of concern, part of the beings that we consider when we think about compassion, when we think about a non-distinction between experiences. This is not to say that the lived experiences in these communities necessarily mirror these aspirations, but I treasure the idea of a larger circle of concern, and I think that one thing that this era of climate change calls us to do is just to see that larger picture.
Yeah, both of you pick up, and already you can hear it under the undercurrent about sort of one's, whether it's one's currently practicing a certain religious faith or just faith. Here we are in this building, a symbol of, of faith on this campus. I mean, could you say some more about how religious folks what role can they play in this, people of faith, to help move in a constructive way forward with some of these challenges? What would be some concrete steps?
I'll go first this time. I think one of the really important things to do is to, from various faith tradition points of view, which have always asked ultimate questions in their traditions, I think what's remarkable about our time is the inability for so many people to ask those ultimate questions anymore. What's the point of what we're doing? I mean, we've got an economy that's growing, and we've got more acquisition of consumption and consumer goods and the kind of lifestyle we want, but almost no ability to have sustained, deep reflection on why we're doing any of this. And so until we can start to ask that question, it's going to be very difficult, I think, for us to put in place a mechanism by which we can judge the kinds of economic, political, social forms of life we're finding ourselves on. So just one example, if you think about food, if the only thing that we care about with food is that it be cheap, convenient, and readily available, well, then we're going to treat our land, we're going to treat our agricultural workers, we're going to, treat the plants and the animals in ways that suggest the only thing that matters about you is that we can access you cheaply. And when we do that, we're going to degrade land, we're going to degrade plants and animals, and we're going to degrade farm workers, and ultimately we degrade the eaters by producing cheap calories that are unhealthy in so many ways. And so religious traditions have long understood that faith calls us to see food as something much more than simply a commodity, right? So we can use the language of gift, we can use the language of sacred blessing or whatever, but to recover this deeper sense of what things mean and what they're for, I think is something vitally important for us to do. And insofar as religious communities and traditions have helped us in the past, I would think it would be great for them to figure out ways to engage in that sort of way today.
Someone else want to chime in on that?
I think we're going boy, girl.
We don't have to.
I guess I'll speak up. I think if the question is, well, I'll take a somewhat different angle on it, which is how has my own faith sort of brought me to explore these issues. So, hi, I'm Brian. I'm the 9th of 11 children. Maybe you can determine, my last name's Murray, so we're starting to look very Irish Catholic, aren't we? It does actually sort of make for interesting conversations about the role of population growth in the world when I have to raise my hand and say, well, I'm 9th. But anyway, maybe that's a different, you'll invite me back for that. But so I was trained by the Jesuits, and the Jesuits have a strong ethos of social justice. Our Pope right now is a Jesuit. And I sort of feel like the faith that I learned in the pews, the faith that I learned in the pews of the Catholic Church in the 1960s was over my head because we were talking about Vatican II, and I didn't even know what that meant. But then, then I've started to rediscover what it meant. But it sort of always laid this sort of notion of social justice, and particularly when I went to a Jesuit school, the motto of the well, there's two mottos for the Jesuit. One of them is Latin, ad maiorem Deum gloriam, for the greater glory of God. The other is a man for others. It's a person for others. But for a while, Jesuits were only training men. I went to an all-boys school. So, the moral foundations there are that we are here not to serve ourselves. We are here to serve others. And as I sort of went through life trying to figure out, I don't think I ever sat down and said, now how am I going to do that? Like the Jesuits told me to do that, and how am I going to do that? But I think that underlying the choices I made to be focused on issues of the environment was really, I think, is deeply seated in my religious upbringing. It's also really kind of what brought me strongly back to the issue a couple of years ago with the Pope's encyclical. And so I was joking with you beforehand when somebody drew circles and said, so do we have any economists who work on climate change who are also Catholic? The intersection of those sets is pretty small. So I started to be asked my opinion on this on National Public Radio and in forums like this. And it really got me to kind of re-explore what does my faith mean. I mean, I was probably practicing a very not faith, amoral or unfaith-based, but I was sort of looking at it in a very, just a very kind of ecumenical way, and it really gave me an opportunity to sort of return and think about my roots and how it drives it. So what does this mean in terms of helping people navigate the road? I think one of the things that was good in the Catholic Church, or at least in my Catholic Church, after the encyclical is it came to the pews. That's the whole purpose of an encyclical. It is teachings of the Pope and of the Church. The idea is that this gets disseminated out to the masses, and I think it brought a lot of good attention there. The problem is that was 2 years ago, and there hasn't been as much attention to there since then. So I think we need to stay on top of this and devote a very sort of faithful approach to this problem.
So this is in some ways the question that is guiding my life and my vocation. So I am increasingly called to, I am Anglican, Pentecostal Anglican, I would describe myself. And
That's an interesting mix in
exactly.
and of itself.
So I'm increasingly called to what it looks like to build the parish, as we call it, or the church, the local community, in an age of ecological catastrophe. And I think that we live in wild and crazy times, and I think it's starting to appear to everyone clearly that we live in wild and crazy times. And I think that the church can't have a mild-mannered response. I think that this calls for radical thinking about living, radical thinking about how we live together, what luxuries we give up, what things hold us in bondage. This has been coming to me a lot. I think part of this whole problem is that we are so in bondage to fossil fuel companies because we love what they give us. And what does it look like? I mean, my Pentecostal background, the idea of deliverance, right? You're delivered from things that hold you in bondage to sin. And I think that as a society, particularly in America, we need to, as a Christian community, think hard about what it means to guide our congregation to experience the freedom of God in terms of freeing ourselves from the possessions that lead to climate change. I think I've been also thinking about how we navigate despair in this time. I think I'm maybe a little bit pessimistic right now about humans' ability to actually turn this train around. We're on our way to 4 degrees Celsius of warming within a century, and we've never lived on an Earth that warm. And I think that we'll see refugee crisis like we've never seen it before. And so what does it mean for Christians to be in that kind of chaos and create spaces of hospitality? I think the good news, the gospel news, is that there's so much resource in Scripture for this. It's really actually very rare that in history that Christians and followers of God have been in places of peace. And most of the time, Christians have been in places of chaos, and particularly in the early church. And God is always calling the Israelites to repent and be obedient and come back from destruction of the land and destruction of others. And so I think that there is a kind of, we call it cruciform, a cross-like nature of climate change, that it doesn't surprise me that humans would treat the earth in a similar fashion to the way they treated the incarnate Lord, that we would crucify it. I think, and what does it mean to be a people of resurrection in the time of climate change? I am particularly interested in how the church forms forms churches that are going to be havens of ecological life. So next year I'm going to be the director of a farm for an Anglican church that has bought 12 acres to turn into a permaculture farm. They want to use aquaponics and other permaculture methods to employ refugees in their congregation. There are many refugees in that congregation from Africa because of the Anglican connections. And I think that kind of creativity is going to have to be at the root of who we are and what we do in the coming century, and listening to world Christians and their voices.
Can I ask a question of Lena? This is really, really good to listen to. And I want to ask you, you're a student, there are a few others at the Div School who see this kind of work as really vital to the work of the church going forward. But there are plenty who don't. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to hear your reflection as a student about what is preventing people, or what could be done to help them come to an understanding of the mission of a faith community to be working in this new context with a new sensibility about ecological concern.
I think I am coming to the conclusion that it's really all about invitation, because you can try to talk someone into it, and sometimes that works. But I think that the other joyful part of this is that living in close-knit, intentional community and doing agricultural work, living in what you can call a transition community that is trying to live with less reliance on fossil fuels, means that relationships are deeper, means that you have your hands in the dirt and are doing things that connect you to what you would describe as our first vocation as humans, to tend to the earth, and that there is such deep-seated joy in that practice, and I think that invitational quality is the same with the Duke Farm or any place that you say, come, like, leave your iPhone addicted life and like dig in a little bit and see what happens. And I think it's slow work, but I think it's one of the reasons that we're building this permaculture at the Divinity School, is that I think rooting down in space and offering space that you can invite people into who don't get it. Maybe they'll get it by coming to a work day and just doing it. I think Anatoth Farm does this well. But I think the other part is preaching. I don't think we preach on it enough. I think we have to preach on it creatively, and really not impose it upon Scripture, but ask what Scripture has to say to this current situation. I think people can detect when you have your ideas and then you impose it upon Scripture, but that there's no reason to do that, because Scripture has everything to say on this issue. Would be my answer.
Saskia, do you want to comment on anything?
Yeah,
heard
I have a very deep-seated belief that working in particular kinds of agriculture can be deeply transformational. So I love what you said, and I see it for people of all faiths or of no faith, that it is a kind of radical way of being together that's not only healing for communities, but I think healing for the environment. As you say, there's so many reasons to be pessimistic. There's so many reasons to be disconnected, overwhelmed, and the idea that we could have not just a catastrophic or even a neutral impact on the places that we live, but actually a positive impact on our environment through restorative agriculture can, I think, be really hope-giving, really enlivening, radical, joyful, all of the things that you mentioned. And that's kind of what gets me up in the morning doing this work.
Before I open it up for questions, hopefully you have some questions for our panelists. You can write it on the card. I want to ask one more question. You're already moving in that direction of thinking about it practically. So if you had the opportunity, not that you would do this, but to grab that image of grabbing the earlobe, right, of the masses or of students or colleagues, ordinary people, much of what we see in many ways of climate and energy policy are really maybe at high governmental levels. So the question is, how can we bridge the gap to enable ordinary people to feel invested in practical environmental solutions? How do we invite, to pick up on
It seems like Saskia would be a good person to start with that.
I like the word that your compatriot used in Brazil, this idea of blindness. And the Buddhist idea of that is called samsara. Right, and when you're enlightened, it means you've cast off this blindness. And I remember a monastic when I came into retreat saying, there's a sweet spot of suffering where you have to be suffering just enough that you're seeking a solution to a problem, but not suffering so much that you're just crippled by agony, depression, sadness. And my hope is that that's the spot where we are here in this moment, that we really are the last generation, the people sitting here in this room that are going to be able to make any kind of significant impact. And that's both a tremendous burden as well as a tremendous opportunity.
I'll follow up on that. I think that you're absolutely right to talk about blindness, and I would extend it a little bit more and say that this is now just speaking more generally, not out of a particular faith tradition, is that for many people living in America today, they have this unprecedented position in the world where they can be completely ignorant of the sources of their own life. They don't have to know a bloomin' thing about food production, about energy production, about soil, about water, because everything is coming to us now through the flip of a switch or the swipe of a screen or whatever. And so environmental issues look to them as entirely abstract. Mm-hmm. And so when people like us get up there and say, don't you realize all the environmental degradation? Well, they have no sense about this because the grocery store is always full, the temperature is always 72, and my gas tank is full. So how can there be a problem? And so there's the blindness, but there's this unprecedented disconnect. And it's not just a mental disconnect. I think it's an embodied disconnect where we no longer feel through our stomachs or through our hands or our taste buds our connections to a larger than human world on which we depend, and therefore we don't have to attend to the world to sense whether or not it's healthy or not. And so finding ways to invite people or grab them by the earlobe, I don't know, so that they can sense the connections to Earth, to other living creatures through their bodies and not simply through their heads, I think is going to be really important moving forward.
If I could chime in on that, because I think you're right, but I think we could expand the view a little bit. I mean, that's very much a view of the very fortunate in a very fortunate country that we just flip a switch on. But we have unfortunate within our own country, So one of the panels that I was on at a local church last year also had an AME minister, and he came and, the issue was sort of put to him, what about your flock? What is your, how much interest are there in these environmental issues and, sustainability? And he said, honestly, there's none. There's very little. I mean, fundamentally, yes, but it sort of, day to day, intellectually or day to day, they're far more concerned about other things, like where is their next paycheck going to come from? Are they going to be able to educate their children? And so I don't mean to suggest that that these problems are so completely unrelated to each other that we got to fix one before we fix the other. We have to fix them all simultaneously. But I do think there's always different perspectives there, even within a wealthy society, that there are many different points of view, not just with other privileged people who say, give me more, give me more, give me more, but there are those who in our own society lack the comforts that we have, and they're seeking them. And so they aren't as concerned about this. This seems like a very bourgeois thing for them to worry about.
Yeah.
I think maybe I'll respond to that too and say that what's giving me hope though is that I'm seeing, I think that agriculture has to be a primary way we address climate change, because I think a lot of people aren't, unfortunately, the climate movement has not become what the food movement has. And I think there's some bad parts about that, because obviously our climate policy is not going anywhere fast despite Paris. but I think that the food movement is really hopeful, and it's now expanding beyond just rich white people. I think that there's a lot of really interesting urban ag going on, and even rural ag. There's a great farm out in Conto, North Carolina, an African-American congregation that started this large farm initiatives because obesity was so high and heart disease, and now they have a really widespread beekeeping program that their kids are in charge of, and they produce pounds and pounds and pounds of food a year. And I think that the media is not covering how this is happening in low-income African American or Latino communities, but it definitely is, and it's of their own initiatives. It's not like white hipsters coming in and being like, y'all need a farm, and I think that is important, and so humbly asking our brothers and sisters in our faith traditions, like, what are you doing in your communities? What cool stuff's going on where you're from? There's so much going on in places like Detroit. It's amazing. All of that empty land is all of a sudden becoming used for cool initiatives, and I think that I think there's already a lot that we should be focusing on that's already happening is one thing, and supporting it and duplicating it and figuring out how to stoke the flames of what's already on fire. I am particularly interested in learning from the Pentecostal movement worldwide. The places that will be most impacted by climate change are also the places that are exploding with Pentecostalism. And people in America have this idea that Pentecostals are prosperity gospel adherents, and I think that's a pretty very limited reductionist idea of what global Pentecostalism is. But what would it be like for us to listen to the voices of those who will be experiencing the effects of climate change and ecological degradation first, and asking them first what their experiences are like? I think that's important.
I think maybe that's what's one thing that feels hopeful to me about agriculture is that the technologies that we need, we actually already have, right? We actually know how to farm in ways to produce food in ways that restore our soils. We know how to produce food in all kinds of climates and all kinds of conditions all over the world. If we just listen to the people who depend on farming for their livelihoods and who are the experts in tracking ebbs and flows in the natural world because their lives literally depend on it. And when I think of it that way, I'm filled with hope that we actually know we have what we need.
Can I also make a sort of an appeal, sort of back to your original point, Luke, about there's big top-down government types of solutions, and then there's bottom-up. And, one thing is that society's actions are the sum of its individual actions, and so we should continue to pursue the right kind of foundation for making the right decisions. But I think one of the most powerful things individuals can do is to get together and try to influence what government is going to do, because the solutions are really, it isn't just, so the question is, how do you end up, what's the most effective way to change the aggregate set of decisions that individuals are making? Is it through preaching the message, or is it through laws and institutions and incentives that get society moving in the right direction? And so I believe it's got to be both. And so when you think about people marching in the streets, and of which we've seen a lot more in the last few months, that is an expression of people's individual moral, ethical position, and then coming together and giving voice to it and getting attention to the matter, which one would hope over time affects the decisions that the government is making.
I have one question here from the audience. If you have any others, please pass those on to Andy. But I also have a final one at the end for your final word. But the question here from our audience is, as the chapel, Duke Chapel, strives to be green and fair, what things would you encourage us to consider? And that's not a question from me, okay? That's someone out here. What things would you encourage us to consider?
Field trips.
To where?
Well, I think all kinds. I think, just to use an analogy, when the new urbanism was developing as a way to try to change the way we design neighborhoods, you can talk about these in the abstract, and you discover that people sort of glaze over after a while. But they discovered that when they took people into communities so they could actually see the differences, suddenly what they were talking about in the abstract became very real and, importantly, very compelling. And so I would say, you know, field trips organized to take people into agricultural communities, into dense urban environments, where we can see firsthand things like food production, things like energy production, things like the health of our water systems, how these things may be in peril or in danger. I think getting people to have a more sensory-rich experience in these contexts and then provide a framework by which to think about what's happening in the experience, I think can be a really powerful tool to use alongside, say, proclamation or things like that.
I think you should rip out your monkey grass. I know that you just finished your landscaping and that it would be a hard thing for Duke to let you do this, but I think that you should grow lots of food around the perimeters of Duke Chapel. And I think that that would really tick off Duke's administration, but I think that it would be awesome. I think to
You
have...
haven't graduated yet, you know.
I know.
true.
And I'll be out of a job.
Got 2
That's
more months,
great.
they can kick me out. But because they don't like messy. But if you got rid of all of the like kind of useless shrubbery and planted fruit trees and different types of fruit bearing and produce bearing perennials. I don't recommend annuals. I think that would be an incredible witness to the fact that there is life inside and outside of the chapel. But
Any other ideas?
You could turn the lights down.
yeah.
As it's glaring in your face. So.
No, I mean, I think these are all good. I really, Norman's point about, I'll just call it expanding your world. You don't have to go that far. You don't have to go very far off of Duke's campus. Norman and I first met working on something called the Winter Forum 7 years ago, which was Duke students come back to campus, or undergraduates come back to campus earlier, and have this focused 2.5-day experience. And so this year it was on called Power to the People, Energy Inequality in a Threatened World. It's not the real name, I just can't remember it. But unfortunately what happened is we hosted it this year and we canceled everything because of the snow and ice. But one of the things we didn't cancel is in preparation for that, we had a filmmaker make a film that was all focused on North Carolina and energy inequality issues. And it went from near a Duke power plant with coal ash in the water supply and how it's contaminating water supply, to East Durham, where energy poverty is rampant and mostly because of substandard housing. So it's tied into a lot of other social justice issues. And then thirdly was an African-American church in eastern North Carolina that had developed a partnership actually with the Rural Electric Cooperative to bring energy efficiency investments into not only to the church, it was actually to the church, not a church like this, it was much smaller and more modest, but into the households of people, so that you were acting on your conviction and your faith and blending together the environment with poverty alleviation and social justice in ways that I think a church is sort of uniquely positioned to play a role. And so I would encourage this type of thoughtful and practical activism.
Maybe if we can't rip out the lawn, we could get some bees.
Bees.
Bees?
Bees live in
Yeah, honeybees.
radical community. Could be a start.
Yes.
All right, we will consider that.
And your liturgical dance could be the bee dance.
You really want to get me fired, Norman. There's, I think, a final question. If there aren't other questions that are written down, and think of it as kind of your final message, right? Here we are in this space, a long tradition of preaching, voices, radical voices, one may say, throughout history. What would be your message in this moment to those that are sitting here or viewing online? What would be your message about all of this to those who might be a part of the so-called rising generation? What's your core message or theme or final word for us?
Inclusion. And I mean, by that I mean spreading out your spheres of influence beyond those who think just like you. I think there are, one of the problems, we're facing a lot of problems in society, but one of them is that we are contracting into echo chambers, and because the issues have gotten so severe, and there seems to have been a breakdown in communication, but I don't think we're going to solve these problems in little pods. So do your best to think about how to involve other people who may not look like you, who may not think like you, and might have different politics than you, and see if you can come to common ground, because I think there's so much common ground that can be had on these issues, and I would just encourage that.
I think I would say, it's not a final word, it's just a word. In very many moments in history of the world, people have thought that they are in the darkest of times and it's all over very soon. And I think a lot of people feel that this is where we are now. And I would especially say to younger folk that keep your love strong, because if you love, you won't stop, even if it looks incredibly dark. So just figure out what is the love of people and the love of places. What's it require of you? And don't worry about whether or not you can know the final outcome. We don't know the final outcome. It's presumptuous for us to think that we know the final outcome. So focus on the love. That would be my word.
I'll follow up on that. My message would be this is a specifically Christian audience, because it's you can only speak to your own faith tradition, I think. I think that we have to get beyond utilitarian thinking, like my actions are only meaningful if they have some ultimate good or it works. So I think with climate change and a lot of these ecological problems, it can get easy to just do nothing because you think your actions are a drop in the bucket. But that's fundamentally not how we're called to behave as Christians. I think that we're called to be obedient, and I think that we have to believe that this dichotomy between, well, God is in control, therefore we need to do nothing, or this is all on us, is a false one. I think that you have to really root down in listening to the Holy Spirit, who is constantly electing, constantly calling us forward to be life givers and to co-participate in the creation and redemption of the world. And I think that if we're good listeners, certainly God will be whispering into our ears things that we can do to bring life where there is no life. And I think that is going to look very different in everyone's lives. I think that we'll have to have some people who are focused on policy, and other people who are focused on planting, and other people who are focused on preaching in the Christian context. And then globally, I'm amazed by the way that God is using people of all different religions and all different backgrounds, scientists, et cetera, and to bring a piece to this that was lacking. So I think affirming the gifts of others and thanking them for their good work. So I thank all of these, my fellow panelists, for their good work.
I would say that somehow we've managed to transform our entire Earth, right? All of our Earth systems in complete ignorance. And we have the chance now to transform them again in mindfulness. And I would maybe just building on these ideas of joy or love and of turning to one another. Maybe another idea would be nourishment, right? To be attentive to what feels nourishing to each of us as individuals on a really deep level, and also how we can nourish one another to continue in this work.
I hope that you have appreciated this panel today, this conversation, all of the gifts and expertise that they represent. And in many ways, what they leave us with is a sense of hope, joy, transformation, love, inclusion, spirit, words that we may not hear through the media so much. But I want to thank our panelists for leaving it and leaving us with a sense of hope that we can take baby steps towards a more hopeful future. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for saying yes to being a part of this panel and this conversation and this special day at Duke Chapel. So let's thank our panelists for being here. I will say that at 2:30 today, this Green and Fair Chapel Day that has been organized, at 2:30 today, there will be a celebration of Holy Communion in the Memorial Chapel, which is the side chapel to my right, at 2:30, to continue to end on a hopeful note together. So thank you all for being here and for your questions and your presence and your ears of listening, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks.